The hardest part wasn't tapping my fork against the crystal flute. It wasn't the screech of the microphone, or the way the room fell dead silent. The hardest part was looking my son in the eye, knowing the few words I was about to say would shatter his world. Leo was always a boy who needed something to fix. When he was 7, it was a robin with a broken wing that died in a shoebox in our garage. At 15, it was a rusted-out Chevy he poured his allowance into, only for the transmission to drop 3 blocks from our driveway. He had this bleeding heart that beat entirely too fast, making him an easy mark for anyone who knew how to feign a limp. Enter Harper. She wasn't the sort of woman who limped into a room. She glided. The first time Leo brought her to the house for Sunday dinner, I caught the scent of her before she even crossed the threshold. Heavy synthetic vanilla layered over something sharp, like rubbing alcohol. It coated the back of my throat. My wife Diane was charmed immediately. Harper knew exactly how to angle her head, how to widen her eyes when Diane spoke about her garden, how to laugh at my dry, obligatory dad jokes with just enough volume to seem authentic. But I watch hands. Hands tell the truth when the mouth is busy lying. While Harper smiled and praised the dry, overcooked pot roast Diane had slaved over, her manicured nails were picking at the cuticle of her thumb, tearing the skin until it was raw. She was assessing us, calculating the square footage, the value of the silver, the softness of the targets. They had been dating for barely 4 months. Leo was 24, fresh out of a grueling master's program, sleep-deprived and vulnerable. Harper was 27, working some vague freelance consulting gig that seemed to require endless hours on her phone and very little actual output. The drop happened on a Tuesday in late October. The air outside was turning bitter, stripping the oaks in our front yard down to bare, shivering branches. They came over unannounced. Leo's face had a gray, waxy pallor to it, his shoulders hunched under his denim jacket. Harper, on the other hand, was glowing, not a maternal glow. It was the flushed, high-voltage energy of someone who had just won a hand of poker with a pair of 2s. "We have news," Leo said. His voice cracked. He sounded like he was apologizing. Diane wiped her hands on her apron, the smell of burnt garlic bread hanging in the kitchen air. "What is it, honey?" Harper reached over and grabbed Leo's hand. Her grip was tight. I saw his knuckles turn white. "We're pregnant," she announced. Her voice rang off the tile floor, bright and piercing. "And we're getting married. Soon. Before I get too big." Diane shrieked, bursting into the kind of instantaneous, joyful tears that only mothers can summon. She threw her arms around Harper, then Leo, babbling about grandbabies and wedding venues. I stood by the island counter. The grain of the granite suddenly looked fascinating. My stomach turned over like a flooded engine. I looked at my son. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were wide, darting toward me for a fraction of a second. A plea, a silent SOS, drowning in the noise of my wife's excitement. Then Harper's hand slid up his back, her nails digging slightly into his shoulder, and the mask slammed back down over his face. He forced a grin. "Congratulations, son," I said. The words tasted like sawdust. I walked over and pulled him into a hug. He felt rigid. He smelled of stale coffee and stale sweat. "Thanks, Dad," he muttered into my collar. "We want to do it by Christmas," Harper chirped, pulling away from Diane. "I know it's a rush, but I just can't bear the thought of walking down the aisle looking like a blimp. Plus, Leo wants to do the right thing. Don't you, baby?" "Yeah," Leo said. "The right thing." Later that night, long after they had driven away and Diane had fallen asleep exhausted by her own elation, I sat in the dark living room with 2 fingers of cheap scotch. The house was settling, the wood framing popping in the cold. I didn't want to be the cynical old man. I wanted to be thrilled. But the math felt wrong. The energy felt wrong. Leo didn't look like a man stepping into his future. He looked like a man being marched to the gallows. I decided right then I wasn't going to just smile and write the checks. I was going to watch. The wedding planning moved with the aggressive, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. Harper moved into Leo's cramped one-bedroom apartment, effectively taking it over. Every time I went over there to help him fix a leaky pipe or drop off groceries, the place felt less like his and more like a staging ground for her. His books were boxed up, her scented candles were everywhere, suffocating the air with that same cloying vanilla. By November, she claimed to be 10 weeks along. I'm no obstetrician, but I raised 3 kids. I know the rhythm of pregnancy, the bone-deep exhaustion, the nausea that doesn't just neatly appear at 8 a.m. and vanish by lunch. Harper's morning sickness was oddly convenient. She was perfectly fine to spend 6 hours at a bridal boutique drinking sparkling cider. But the moment Leo suggested she help him pack up his storage unit, the nausea would strike, confining her to the couch with a tragic sigh. The first real crack appeared 3 weeks before the wedding. I was at their apartment. Leo was at work, but he had asked me to come by and wait for the cable guy. Harper was allegedly asleep in the bedroom, resting her aching back. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, drinking tap water out of a hazy glass, when I noticed the recycling bin was overflowing. Being the restless old man I am, I decided to take it down to the dumpster. As I pulled the plastic bag from the bin, a small, crushed cardboard box spilled out onto the linoleum. I bent down to pick it up. It was a pink and white box, a pregnancy test, but the branding was strange. It didn't say first response or clear blue. It said prank O. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. I stood perfectly still, the rough cardboard pressing into my thumb. Always turns positive, the side flap boasted in tiny, cheerful font. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I felt a sudden, violent surge of disgust, partly at what I was holding, and partly at myself for the dark, paranoid thrill it gave me. I shoved the box into my coat pocket. I didn't confront her. Not then. You don't blow up a bridge until you know exactly where the structural weaknesses are. Instead, I became a quiet, miserable spy in my own son's life. A few days later, they came over for dinner. Harper was rubbing her perfectly flat stomach, complaining about her hips expanding. Diane was cooing, offering her more mashed potatoes. "Have you had the first ultrasound yet?" I asked casually, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. I sliced into my chicken. "We'd love to see the little bean." The table went quiet. Harper's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I looked up. Her eyes were flat, calculating. "We did," she said smoothly, "just last week. But the technician said the printout machine was broken. They're supposed to email the files, but the clinic is so disorganized." "Which clinic?" I asked. "Dad," Leo warned softly. "Just asking, Leo. Our insurance covers Dr. Evans over at St. Jude's. He's fantastic." "We went to a boutique place," Harper said, her tone hardening just a fraction. "A holistic wellness center. Better vibes." It was a lie. You could smell it. It smelled like the ozone before a lightning strike. The next afternoon, I broke a promise to myself. I committed a severe invasion of privacy. Leo had left his old iPad at our house months ago, the one still logged into his Apple account, which synced with his laptop. I sat in my garage, the smell of motor oil and old dust surrounding me, and I opened the browser history. I felt dirty. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I told myself I was protecting him. I scrolled past Leo's searches, work emails, sports scores, recipes for cheap dinners. Then, the searches changed. Searches made late at night, from the shared laptop at their apartment. How to fake an ultrasound picture free. What do 12-week pregnancy symptoms look like? Can a doctor tell if you've never been pregnant? Custom silicone belly bump stage 1. I closed the iPad. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me. I looked tired. I looked like a man who had just watched a car crash in slow motion. She wasn't pregnant. There was no baby. It was a snare, carefully laid out, and my son had walked right into it, his bleeding heart leading the way. The wedding was 2 weeks away. She was rushing the ring onto his finger, securing the legal tie, the shared assets, the commitment, before she would inevitably suffer a tragic miscarriage shortly after the honeymoon. It was a classic, sociopathic play. I poured myself a drink. My hands were shaking. I wanted to drive over there, kick the door in, and drag my son out by his collar. But Leo was fiercely loyal. If I went to him with browser histories and a crushed cardboard box, Harper would spin it. She'd cry. She'd say I planted it. She'd say the searches were for a fictional story she was writing, or some other absurd lie that Leo, desperate to believe in her, would swallow. She would force him to choose, and she had spent the last 5 months making sure he was entirely dependent on her emotional validation. If I did it quietly, I would lose him. I had to rip the mask off in a place where she couldn't hide, where she couldn't manipulate the narrative. The rehearsal dinner was held in the back room of an overpriced Italian restaurant downtown. The air was thick with the smell of roasting garlic, expensive perfume, and burning wax from the centerpieces. It was claustrophobic. Tomorrow was the wedding. Leo was sitting at the head of the long table, looking like a hostage in a tailored suit. The collar of his shirt was biting into his neck. He was nursing a glass of water, his eyes glassy and distant. Harper was holding court. She wore a tight, ruched dress that deliberately emphasized a tiny, almost imperceptible curve at her abdomen, the silicone bump. I realized with a sick twist in my gut. She was laughing loudly, tossing her head back, accepting the early wedding gifts and the congratulations with a practiced, radiant humility. I watched her sip from a glass of what was supposed to be sparkling cider, but I had been at the bar when she ordered it. I saw her slip the bartender a 20. It was Prosecco. Diane squeezed my knee under the table. "Isn't it beautiful, Martin?" she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "Our boy." "Yeah," I rasped. "Beautiful." I felt like a traitor to my own wife. I hadn't told Diane. Diane wears her heart on her sleeve. If she knew, she wouldn't have been able to make it through the appetizers without lunging across the table. About halfway through the agonizing evening, Leo stood up to use the restroom. I waited 30 seconds, threw my napkin on my plate, and followed him. I caught him not in the bathroom, but slipping out the heavy steel back door into the alleyway behind the restaurant. I pushed the door open. The alley smelled of wet cardboard, rotting produce, and stale beer from the neighboring dive bar. A harsh yellow sodium light buzzed overhead. Leo was leaning against the brick wall, pulling a crushed pack of cigarettes from his inner pocket. He hadn't smoked since college. He put the cigarette between his lips, his hands trembling as he struck a match. He took a deep drag and closed his eyes. "Thought you quit those," I said, stepping into the yellow light. He jumped, dropping the match. "Dad, Jesus, you scared me." "Sorry." I leaned against the brick wall next to him. The night air was freezing, biting through my thin suit jacket. We stood in silence for a long moment, watching the smoke curl up toward the fire escape. "You don't have to do this, Leo," I said quietly. He didn't look at me. "Do what? Get married?" He let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Bit late for cold feet, Dad. The deposits are paid. Mom's got her dress." "I don't give a damn about the deposits, and neither does your mother." I turned to face him. "Look at yourself. You look like you haven't slept in a month. You look miserable." Leo squeezed his eyes shut. "I'm just tired, Dad. It's a lot, the baby. It's a lot." "Leo." The words were right there, on the tip of my tongue. "She's lying. There is no baby. Run." I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me. If there's something wrong, if you're feeling trapped, you can walk away. Right now. I'll drive you to the airport. We'll figure out the fallout later." He pulled away from my hand. The sudden flare of defensiveness in his eyes was exactly what I had feared. Trapped? I'm not trapped. Harper needs me. She's carrying my child. He threw the half-smoked cigarette onto the wet asphalt and crushed it with his heel. "She had a rough childhood, Dad. People always abandon her. I'm not going to be another person who walks out on her when things get hard." The savior complex. She had weaponized his best trait against him. Before I could try again, the heavy steel door creaked open. Harper stood there, silhouetted by the warm light of the restaurant. The air shifted, immediately. "There you are," she said. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes locked onto me with the cold, dead stare of a shark. I was getting worried. "It's freezing out here, baby." Leo's posture changed instantly. He straightened up, the exhaustion replaced by a forced, attentive energy. "Just getting some air. Harp. Sorry." "Come back inside," she purred, reaching a hand out to him. "People are waiting for the toasts." She looked at me, a tiny, triumphant smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. "Are you coming, Martin?" "In a minute," I said. I watched him follow her back inside like a dog on a short leash. The door clanged shut, leaving me alone in the freezing alley. I leaned my head back against the cold brick. I had tried to give him an out. I had tried to let him save himself. But she had him completely blinded by guilt and a false sense of duty. If I dragged the truth out in private, she would twist it into a narrative of my cruelty and his victimhood. They would elope. I would never see him again. I reached into my breast pocket and felt the crisp edges of the folded piece of paper I had brought with me. It was a printout of the clinic receipt I had found stuffed in the glove box of her car that afternoon. A receipt for an anti-nausea prescription, not for morning sickness, for hangovers. Attached to it was the credit card statement showing the purchase from Pranko and a screenshot of the silicone belly order. A quiet intervention was dead. She wanted an audience. She wanted a show. Fine. I pushed off the brick wall, my blood running hot despite the cold. I walked back into the restaurant, the heavy door shutting behind me with the finality of a vault. Tomorrow, I was giving the Father-of-the-Groom toast, and I was going to burn her kingdom to the ground. The morning of the wedding arrived with a dull gray sky that pressed down heavily on the city. It didn't rain, but the air felt bruised, thick with impending pressure. I stood in front of the steamed-up bathroom mirror, holding a safety razor with a white-knuckled grip. The smell of cheap shaving cream, a sharp, artificial pine scent I had used since I was 20, filled my nostrils. I scraped the blade down my jawline, watching my own reflection. My eyes looked bruised, underlined by dark, heavy bags. I hadn't slept a single minute. Every time I had closed my eyes, I saw Leo standing in that freezing alleyway, pulling a cigarette to his lips, crushed under the weight of a phantom child. Diane bustled into our bedroom behind me, a whirlwind of nervous, joyful energy. She was wearing a plum-colored dress that swished against her nylon-clad legs. Her hair was heavily sprayed, giving off a chemical sweetness that mingled terribly with my pine shaving cream. "Martin, your tie," she scolded gently, standing on her tiptoes to loop the blue silk around my collar. Her fingers were warm and trembling slightly. "Can you believe it? Our little boy. He's starting his own family today. It feels like just yesterday he was running through the sprinklers in the backyard." I looked down at my wife. Her eyes were bright, brimming with an innocent, unadulterated happiness that made my stomach twist into a painful knot. I was about to murder her joy. I was going to take a sledgehammer to this day, and the collateral damage would splash right across her beautiful, smiling face. Yeah, I forced the word out. It scraped against my throat just yesterday. The drive to the church was an exercise in silent suffocation. The heater in my sedan blew dry, stale air directly into my face. Diane chattered endlessly about the floral arrangements and the caterer, oblivious to the fact that I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands were cramping. Tucked inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket, lying flat against my chest, was the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy, as if I were carrying a slab of lead over my heart. Inside were the printed receipts, the screenshot of the silicone belly order, and the credit card statements. The arsenal. The church was an old echoing stone cathedral. It smelled of floor wax, ancient wood, and the overwhelming heady fragrance of hundreds of white lilies packed into every available corner. The pews were filled with people, relatives I hadn't seen in a decade, Leo's college buddies looking stiff in rented suits, and Harper's guests a sparse, eclectic collection of people who looked more like casual acquaintances than family. I took my place in the front pew next to Diane. The organ music swelled, a vibrating bass-heavy hum that rattled the polished floorboards beneath my leather shoes. Then, Leo stepped out from the side room. My breath caught. He looked handsome, wearing a charcoal tuxedo that fit him perfectly, but his posture was terrible. His shoulders slouched, and his hands were clasped together in front of him, the knuckles bone white. He was sweating. A thin sheen of moisture coated his forehead, catching the stained glass light. He looked less like a groom and more like a prisoner of war, waiting for the firing squad. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the wooden altar. The doors at the back of the church groaned open. The congregation rose with a collective rustle of fabric. Harper walked down the aisle. She wore a custom gown, draped perfectly to accommodate the lie. The fabric was gathered at her waist, creating a gentle, maternal swell that wasn't there 48 hours ago in her tight rehearsal dinner dress. She was a masterclass in performance. Her smile was tremulous, her eyes glistening with perfectly timed, unshed tears. She looked at Leo with an expression of such pure, manufactured devotion that I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. She reached the altar. Leo took her hand. I watched his thumb rub across her knuckles, a desperate, unconscious gesture seeking comfort from the very thing that was suffocating him. The pastor, a kind-faced man named Miller, began speaking. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, blending with the smell of the lilies. Words like honor, truth, and forsaking all others drifted over the pews. I tuned them out. The hypocrisy of it was too loud. I focused on Harper's left hand, the one holding Leo's. She was using her thumb to gently stroke his wrist, keeping him tethered, keeping him grounded in the illusion. Leo, take you, Harper. Leo's voice cracked on the microphone. It wasn't a crack of emotion. It was the sound of a dry, terrified throat. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, to have and to hold. From this day forward, I, Harper, take you, Leo. Her voice was smooth, confident, cutting through the heavy air like a silver bell. When they kissed, the church erupted into applause. Diane buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing happily. I patted her back mechanically, my eyes fixed on the couple. Harper pulled away from the kiss and looked out at the congregation. For a fraction of a second, her eyes met mine. The tremulous, blushing bride vanished. Her gaze was flat, hard, and terrifyingly victorious. She had done it. She had the ring. She had the legal binding. The reception was held at a sprawling country club on the edge of town. The transition from the solemn, echoing church to the chaotic, noisy banquet hall was jarring. The room was a sea of circular tables draped in heavy white linen, clinking silverware, and the dull roar of 100 conversations overlapping. A jazz band played in the corner, the brass notes bouncing off the glass chandeliers. The air smelled of roasting meat, heavy butter sauces, and the sharp tang of spilled alcohol. I sat at the head table, flanked by Diane and Leo's best man, a nervous kid named Greg who kept sweating through his shirt. Leo and Harper sat in the center. Harper was radiant, sipping her faux sparkling cider, laughing, accepting envelopes of cash from passing relatives. Leo was drinking, heavily. I watched him signal the bartender twice during the salad course alone, downing amber liquid from a lowball glass with the desperation of a man trying to put out a fire in his own chest. "Eat something, Martin," Diane scolded softly, tapping my plate with her manicured fingernail. The chicken in front of me was rubbery, sitting in a pool of congealing yellow sauce beside 3 limp stalks of asparagus. "Not hungry," I muttered, pushing the plate away. The minutes dragged out like hours. The room grew warmer, the noise grew louder. The condensation from my water glass pooled onto the white tablecloth, soaking into the thick cotton. I pressed my thumb into the wet spot, watching the water seep into the fibers. Every time the waiters cleared a set of plates, my heart rate spiked. Finally, the band stopped playing. The lead singer tapped the microphone. The sharp, high-pitched thud cut through the chatter, commanding the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the singer announced, his voice booming over the speakers, "if we could turn our attention to the head table, it is time for the toasts." The room quieted down. The scraping of chairs echoed as people turned toward us. The air shifted, growing heavy with expectation. First up was the maid of honor, a girl named Brittany who spoke for 10 minutes about how Harper was the most genuine soul she had ever met. It was an agonizing display of misplaced loyalty. Then came Greg, the best man, who stumbled through a few mildly inappropriate college stories before aggressively thanking the catering staff. Then, the microphone was passed to me. The smooth black plastic of the mic felt cold in my sweating palm. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor behind me. I looked out at the sea of faces. 100 pairs of eyes stared back. I saw Diane looking up at me, a proud, expectant smile on her lips. I saw my brother Frank at table 4, swirling his wine, and I saw Leo. He was staring down at his empty glass, his shoulders hunched. Beside him, Harper adjusted her posture, sitting up perfectly straight, resting one hand delicately over the silicone bump beneath her dress. She smiled at me, a perfectly polite, untouchable smile. I reached into my breast pocket. My fingers brushed the rough edge of the envelope. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the table in front of me. "Hello, everyone," I said. My voice echoed back at me through the massive speakers. It sounded foreign, like it belonged to an older, much angrier man. "For those who don't know me, I'm Martin, Leo's father." A smattering of polite applause drifted through the room. I waited for it to die down completely. I needed absolute silence. When Leo was a boy, he was the kind of kid who couldn't stand to see anything suffer. I began, gripping the edges of the podium. He brought home stray dogs, broken birds, kids from school who didn't have a place to go. He has a heart that is too big for his ribcage. It is his greatest strength. I paused, looking directly at my son. He slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes meeting mine. And it is his greatest vulnerability. The room was still polite, but the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. The smiles on the faces of the guests wavered, sensing a shift in the tone. This wasn't the standard, jovial, father-of-the-groom banter. Marriage is supposed to be built on a foundation of absolute, unshakable truth, I continued, my voice steadying, hardening into steel. It requires standing in front of your partner, completely exposed, and trusting them not to hold a knife to your back. Leo believed he was doing the right thing today. He believed he was stepping up to take responsibility, because my son is a good man. I looked down at Harper. Her polite smile had vanished. Her jaw was locked tight, a tiny muscle twitching near her ear. Her hand slipped off her stomach and gripped the edge of the table. She knew. The feral instinct of a cornered animal flashed in her dark eyes. "But you cannot build a marriage on a trap," I said, leaning closer to the microphone. The words boomed through the hall. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Diane touched my arm, her fingers squeezing my sleeve. "Martin," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I ignored her. I picked up the envelope from the table. The paper crinkled loudly. "Over the last few months, I've watched my son wither," I said, my voice rising, cutting over the growing whispers in the room. I watched him drown in guilt and panic over a pregnancy that does not exist. Someone in the back of the room gasped. The sound of a silver fork hitting a china plate rang out like a gunshot. Leo shot up out of his chair. "Dad, stop!" he yelled, his voice cracking violently. "What the hell are you talking about? Stop talking!" "Sit down, Leo," I barked back, the authority of a father snapping out of me before I could control it. He froze, suspended halfway between standing and sitting. Harper stood up instantly. Her chair tipped backward, crashing onto the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. "Martin, you are drunk," she shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. She reached for Leo's arm. "Leo, tell him to stop. He's ruining our day. He's insane." "I am perfectly sober," I said coldly. I pulled the papers from the envelope. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I felt a terrifying, absolute calm. "You want to talk about insanity, Harper?" Let's talk about the $140 charged to a company called Pranko for a fake positive pregnancy test. I tossed the first sheet of paper onto the center of the head table. It slid across the smooth white linen, coming to rest right in front of Leo's empty lowball glass. Let's talk about the search history on the shared iPad, I continued, my voice relentless, hammering the nails into the coffin. Let's talk about the anti-nausea medication you supposedly took for morning sickness, which was actually an emergency prescription for a hangover from a clinic downtown. I threw the second paper. It landed over the first. Harper lunged across the table. Her manicured nails scrambled wildly over the linen, desperately trying to grab the papers, but she was too slow. Leo snatched them up first. "Let me see those," Harper shrieked, all pretense of elegance gone. Her face was flushed dark red, the veins in her neck bulging. She looked monstrous. "Leo, don't look at them. He forged them. He hates me. He's always hated me." Leo stood perfectly still. The noise of the room, the gasps, the scraping chairs, the panicked whispers of 100 guests seemed to vanish. He stared down at the printed credit card statement. He stared at the screenshot of the website showing the exact custom silicone belly pad she was currently wearing under her expensive gown. I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't a sudden explosion of anger, it was an implosion. It was the physical collapse of a man whose entire reality had just been kicked out from under him. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him the color of wet ash. His breathing became shallow, rapid, hitching in his throat. "Leo," Harper pleaded, her voice dropping into a desperate, manufactured whine. She reached out to touch his chest. "Baby, please. You know me. You know I'm carrying our child." Leo looked up from the papers. He looked at her hand resting on his chest, then down to her stomach. In a sudden, jerky movement, he reached out and grabbed the fabric of her dress right at the waistline. Harper screamed, trying to twist away, but his grip was iron. He pulled, hard. The delicate fabric ripped with a loud, sickening sound. Beneath the silk, strapped tightly over her flat stomach, was a thick, flesh-colored silicone pad. The silence that fell over the reception hall was absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying vacuum of sound. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator units behind the bar. You could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of my son. Harper stared down at her exposed midriff. The lie was laid bare under the bright chandelier lights. The silicone looked grotesque, unnatural. She slowly raised her head, looking around the room. Her own family was staring at her in horror. Brittany, the maid of honor, had a hand clamped over her mouth. Harper stammered, stepping backward, her heel catching on the hem of her torn dress. "I can explain. I wanted to make sure you stayed. Leo, I loved you so much, I just needed to be sure." "Don't," Leo whispered. His voice was hollow. It didn't even sound human. He dropped the papers onto the floor. "Leo, please, don't touch me," he said, stepping away from her as if she were radioactive. He looked down at his left hand. The gold band caught the light. He grabbed the ring, twisting it violently over his knuckle, tearing the skin, and threw it onto the table. It clattered against a wine glass with a sharp ding. Without looking at me, without looking at his mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, Leo turned and walked off the raised platform. He walked down the center aisle of the banquet hall, passing the sea of shocked, silent faces. He pushed open the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the room and disappeared into the night. Harper stood alone at the table, the torn dress hanging off her shoulder, the fake belly exposed. She looked at me. There was no more screaming. There was just a cold, venomous hatred. "Are you happy now?" she hissed, the words barely carrying over the microphone. "You ruined his life." "No," I said softly, setting the microphone down on the podium. The feedback whined briefly before dying out. "I just gave him his life back. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I didn't stay to watch the guests slowly pack up their coats and leave the untouched dinners. I walked down from the podium, took my weeping wife by the arm, and guided her out of the room. We found Leo sitting on the curb in the parking lot. his tuxedo jacket discarded on the wet asphalt. His head was buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. The cold night air smelled of exhaust fumes and impending rain. I walked over and sat down on the damp concrete next to him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I just put my arm around his shoulders, pulled his shaking frame against me, and let him cry in the dark. The kingdom was in ashes. The collateral damage was severe. But as I sat there shivering in my suit, holding my broken boy, I knew one thing for certain. We had survived the fire. What would you have done in my shoes? If you found this story compelling, please hit the like button and share it with anyone who needs a reminder to trust their gut. Don't forget to subscribe for more raw, unfiltered stories about the messy reality of family, betrayal, and the lengths we go to protect the ones we love. Drop a comment below with your thoughts.